United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said in July that our world is facing a dramatic climate emergency. He said the goal to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees is in intensive care, but we risk seeing it lost irreversibly in the years to come. Achieving global carbon neutrality by 2050 is a crucial part of tackling this climate emergency. But rising restrictions on coal and oil imports from Russia due to the Russia-Ukraine conflict has added an extra layer to the crisis. So now we must ask ourselves, how will the energy security crisis impact efforts to achieve carbon neutrality? Some say now is the best time to accelerate global green energy transition. Others say we have to wait, with a difficult winter just around the corner. Amid such global energy uncertainty, how to keep carbon neutrality high on the political agenda of the world's major players? How can developing countries, including China, strike a balance between energy transition and security? What's at stake? Welcome to this special edition of the Global Thinkers Forum, brought to you by CGTN from Beijing. I'm Liu Xin. I'm pleased to be joined from London by Anthony Froggatt, Deputy Director of the Environment and Society Program of Chatham House. From New Jersey, the US, by Dr. Chris Craig, Senior Research Scientist of Princeton University. From Beijing, by Associate Professor Teng Fei, Deputy Director of the Institute of Energy, Environment and Economy of Tsinghua University. And from South China's Shenzhen, by Zhai Yongping, Senior Advisor on Carbon Neutrality of the Chinese tech giant Tencent. He is also former chief of the energy sector group at Asia Development Bank. The warmest welcome to all our panelists from around the world. I'm also extremely pleased to be joined virtually by experts and scholars in energy and environmental studies, journalists and other guests from related fields from China, Pakistan, India, the UK, Kenya, and etc. The warmest welcome to all of you. Let me turn to my first guest, Professor Teng Fei there. As we've heard and as mentioned, basically very often in China, clear waters and green mountains are invaluable assets. Now, this assertion was made by Mr. Xi Jinping as early as in 2005, while he was still serving as party chief of Zhejiang province in eastern China. Since then, he has mentioned this on many, many occasions, both inside China and also international occasions. Now it has, of course, been written into China's top development guidelines, plans, and as well as into the constitution of the ruling Communist Party of China, just to say how important this is. What's the relationship between this philosophy and China's carbon neutrality goals?
Well, I think this philosophy is the basis for China's carbon neutrality goals. Because of this philosophy basically says the natural resource has its value that on people. And that is also the case for the carbon emission and carbon neutralities, that to maintain the sustainable development of humanity, we need to reduce and limit our emission within a given space. This is so-called carbon space. And to achieve that, we need to recognize the value of that carbon space. And we also need to achieve that as a whole society. And that is what has been mentioned in this philosophy. And also, we need to achieve this as a whole from the international perspective. So as human society, we need to cooperate together to reduce our emission and to make our environmental safe. And because of there is only one Earth. So from regard, I think that the carbon neutrality is very much consistent with this philosophy. And that is why China promotes the idea of carbon neutrality and use that as a basis that provide common goods that to the whole society. And that will be the China's dream, and that will be the future of our society.
Right. However, how to implement this philosophy, how to turn it into action is, let's say, something of an art. Let's say, I want to turn to Mr. Zhai for my second question, because Chinese President Xi said this January that strategic thinking must be improved, as people should bear in mind the big picture throughout the whole process of delivering the carbon peaking and neutrality goals. He said the relationship between development and emission reduction must be properly handled. What does that mean, and what's the implication from China's perspective on the global fight to peak carbon emissions?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think most important thing is to bear in mind that this carbon neutrality ambition should be, first of all, people-oriented. I mean by that when we say we will reduce carbon emissions, we would continue to improve living standards of people. When I remember my work in Africa, I still see people living without access to electricity, without clean energy for cooking. So I think when we say we are pursuing improvement in energy efficiency, reducing carbon emissions, we have to bear in mind that we continue to improve the life of living standard of the poor people. So that's the first point. And the second point is that this is a historic chance for China and for the whole world to upgrade ourselves in the way we are living, and we are producing products by reducing a reliance on heavily polluting fossil fuels. So this will give us chance to move to another level in our development, in civilization.
Let me turn to my European guests, and Anthony, Mr. Froggatt, if you will. We are looking at a pretty intense situation in Europe, obviously because of the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Now, European countries were ambitious to wean themselves from the dependence of imported oil and gas, and now with the energy crisis, how do you assess the situation, the level of difficulty that European countries are facing in meeting their carbon neutrality goals, and how much headwinds are European governments facing in doing just that?
Yeah, I mean, clearly the situation in Europe is very serious. Europe has had, prior to the war, had significant dependency on Russia for its energy sources, and that's coal, oil, and gas, and particularly gas. While that is happening, there is a switch in fossil fuel supplies. So the EU is importing more fossil fuels from other parts of the world, the United States in particular, in terms of liquefied natural gas, and is burning more coal domestically. So on that side, it is negative for climate change. But there are also very positive things taking place. And if I can just give two examples. The first, if you look at the role of renewable energy. So renewable energies have been promoted in the EU primarily for climate change reasons. And if you look back to 2015, at the time of the Paris Climate Conference, the EU said it would reduce its emissions by 40% by 2030. And that involved renewables providing around 32% of the EU's energy. Then as the EU increased its pledge in terms of 2030 carbon emissions for the Glasgow conference last year, to 55% reduction in emissions, they then increased the share that renewables would play to 40% of total energy supply. So as the carbon emissions ambition increased, so did the role of renewable energy. And then now what we've seen in the last few months is, as there is a desire to decrease dependency on Russian fuels very quickly, the target for the role of renewables has increased even further. So it's now 45% of the EU's energy by 2030. So what we're seeing is renewables playing a role both in energy security and in climate change.
So basically finding opportunities in a time of crisis. Dr. Craig, let me turn to you. You seem to be to have invested quite a lot of your time and energy into the role of the private sector in combating climate change. And you published in a recent article about a large gap between the ambitious pledges being made by many companies and their actual operations, but also that there is, you said, often insufficient data to verify alignment. So what explains the phenomenon, and how significant is that a problem in the global efforts to tackle climate change?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Look, I think we're at a stage now where since 2015, we've become very serious about the need for action. And so we're making these promises around transitioning to net zero. Now the hard bit comes in, right? So making the promises easy. Executing on the promises is really difficult. And so I think we've seen companies at a stage where, for a multitude of reasons, it might be shareholder pressure, it might be just societal pressure and customer pressure, that they know they need to transition. But you're talking about, generation companies, you're talking about transportation companies, oil and gas companies who have this competing dilemma of an incumbent asset base, supply chains, customers, etc. And they can't just switch that off overnight. And so they're all grappling really with how they're going to make that transition. Meanwhile, the promise still stands. And so what we tried to do was really just shine a light on the fact that there's still a big gap between this ambition and what they actually have to do. But I think the same is true for countries, right? It's true of companies, but I think all countries are also wrestling with this challenge.
Let me turn to Professor Teng to pick up on that very important note. Maybe in the short term, Chris was talking about maybe we're going to see a rising level of emissions. What's the expectation from China? Because we know China imported quite some oil from Russia. What's the rationale behind China's moves, and does that say anything about China's pledge in terms of carbon peaking and carbon neutrality?
Before the April of this year, the Russian oil is more expensive than other resources. So after April, the Russia reduced its oil price, and the Russian oil became much more cheaper, about 20% than other oil sources. So that is basically the reason that why China increased its oil import from Russia, because for every decrease of $1 oil price, China can save about $4 billion every year. And
does that also mean that China is going to consume more oil?
I don't think so, because if we look at the numbers that in the last year, 2021, China consumed about 700 million tons of oil, a decrease of about 3% compared with the year 2020. And also China is developing a lot of policy that to incentivize the reduction of oil consumption in transportation sectors. For example, that China is the largest or the number one new energy vehicle market, both the producers and consumers. In last year, China produced more than 3 million new energy vehicles, much larger than United States and Europe. And that is a clear signal that how China will move towards a low carbon transportation sector, and that will also reduce China's oil consumption in the future and help to achieve China's carbon peaking and carbon neutrality targets.
Let's take on the topic of the role that Chinese tech companies or Chinese internet giants can potentially play in bringing down carbon emissions. And I want to turn to Mr. Zhai. What kind of new technologies is being implemented or experimented by technology companies such as Tencent, Huawei, Baidu, so on and so forth? And is there a gap as well between the ambitions of the Chinese private sector with the kind of actions they're following through?
Yes, as you mentioned that I currently working as a technical advisor to Tencent. for its ambition on carbon neutrality. This itself a proof that the company is fully committed to continue to support the carbon neutrality, not only for the company itself. Actually, we have set a target for the company itself for achieving carbon neutrality by 2030. This is for our company's own business. But beyond that, I think the most important part of our ambition, like other tech giants in China or elsewhere, is our ability to use digital technologies to support the whole society in delivering carbon neutrality objective in 3 ways. First of all, supporting a change of lifestyle of consumers through through WeChat, for example, the social media service we are having. Secondly, Tencent is using its digital technology platforms to support business or companies in transforming their way of production so that the production process will be more efficient with less emissions. And we're also looking at the way of reducing their emissions by combination of different technologies. So that's our support to business. The third point is our support to nurturing the new technologies, as you mentioned, like, for example, in hydrogen, energy storage, carbon capture and storage, CCUS, so that Tencent is supporting these emerging technologies, as we know that for the country or the whole world to achieve carbon neutrality by middle of this century, we will need these technologies.
Mr. Froggatt, let me turn to you for some European perspective. What's the situation on the private sector or the use of innovative technology in terms of accelerating efforts towards carbon neutrality goals that you can share with us at this moment?
Well, I think Europe has been, and I hope will continue to be, a sort of major driver of technology change. And I think it's important both in terms of what it develops domestically, but also in terms of the market that it creates. And I think a really interesting example is in the turn of the century, when you saw the EU, or in fact Germany, put in place feed-in tariffs for solar PV. So for the first time, if you installed solar panels, you were guaranteed a fixed price for the electricity that was generated. And that encouraged a real boom in the development of solar panels. And that then encouraged other countries, in particular China, to develop a solar PV industry that could then supply PV to Europe. And we've seen that occurring very clearly. I mean, China now is the major supplier of global PV panels. Around 70% are produced here in China. But it's the EU that created the policy and the market to enable that to happen. And I think we're seeing similar things in terms of electric vehicles. We'll see that to some degree in hydrogen and storage. So the EU, because it is, I would say, quite advanced in terms of its decarbonisation plans and looking at what the implications of that are. So I mentioned before that the plan is that 40% of the EU's energy comes from renewables by 2030. And that's energy, that's not electricity. So the share of renewable electricity within the next decade may well be 60, 70, or even 80%. And that has a huge implication for how the grid operates. And then we'll need new technologies, the balancing opportunities, the storage opportunities, or the storage technologies. And so Europe is, through its very structural changes within its markets, within its sectors, encouraging innovation and trialing new technologies. And I think that is a really, really important role for Europe.
Dr. Craig, are you equally optimistic about the kind of prospects that Europe is seeing? Share with us your assessment, please. And also in the United States, President Biden just signed into law a legislation called Inflation Reduction Act, which pledges $370 billion in climate investment over the next decade. Some people are welcoming it, saying that this will cut U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by about 30 to 40% below 2005 levels. Do you see the U.S. on track in fulfilling its carbon goals and even ahead of time because of such legislation?
Yeah, thank you. Look, as of the last couple of weeks, obviously things turned around in the US. We were feeling a little dejected for a while, but the Inflation Reduction Act got passed, and whilst it is not as ambitious as the Build Back Better Act that had been proposed and had died over the past year, it is certainly going to make a big difference. Our assessment is that it should put us on track to a 40% reduction by 2030 relative to 2005 goals. Now, that's short of the President's stated ambition of 50 to 52%, but I think it's consistent with where we think we need to be to reach net zero by 2050. So I think the US is in much better shape now, and I think the execution is still there, right? We have all the incentives we need. It's a coordination challenge now because we've got to simultaneously expand demand for clean hydrogen and supply. And so there could be some chicken or egg issues that won't be solved simply with incentives. And I think the same is true in Europe. I think we have the right policy settings. We now need to get the right kind of stimulus between government and the private sector to coordinate these what I think are very ambitious expansions of new technologies.
All right, thank you very much. Time is really running out fast. I'm going to give a couple of minutes to our spectators online to ask a question to any of the four panelists. Yes, I see a gentleman there. Please unmute yourself.
This is Iftikhar Shirazi, Dawn News, Pakistan. I would like to ask a question to the participant. I mean, Pakistan is one of the 5 top countries which are on the receiving end when you talk about the climate change. But we are facing serious problems in the energy sector. I need some investment to have wind energy. I need some investment to have hydro energy. But the Western countries, not taking so much interest to help out Pakistan in this area. And again, if you reduce the carbon emission in Pakistan, you need a best and effective transport system in this country. So these are the areas where, if the European and the other rich countries focus, you can contribute not only to reduce carbon emission in Pakistan, but also help Pakistan to have a better and safe energy. So I need some comments from my participant why the European Union and countries like US are not focusing in this area.
All right.
Yeah, I think it's really problematic because it is a global problem. We know that unless all countries take action, then we're not going to achieve the global targets. We know that the richer countries from the OECD and G7 do need to give significantly more finance for both mitigation but also adaptation, because as you point out, many of the countries who are less developed will bear the brunt of many of the climate consequences of climate change. So I can only say I agree that EU developed countries need to do more. There was some progress prior to COP26 in Glasgow. It was inadequate. And I very much hope that as we move towards COP27 in November of this year, that climate finance does remain an important issue because it's hosted by Egypt. I'm sure that it will. And I hope that there is more money forthcoming and more cooperation. But we have to recognize the extent to which the current situation in Ukraine has affected the economies around the world. And so, yeah, it's going to be a tough ask.
All right. We are going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to have the second part of our discussion on carbon neutrality. What kind of global cooperation is needed? And do major players in the world have the appetite or capacity to carry out that kind of cooperation? Stay with us.
Making sense of the overwhelming wave of information means cutting through the noise to shine a light on the heart of the story and making room for new perspectives. True understanding means the ability to see events from more than one side. I'm Liu Xin, and this is The Point.
Welcome back. To fulfill climate commitments, countries are facing multiple hurdles. Should we be adjusting our expectations around energy policy commitments, or is now the right moment to make these crucial but difficult changes amid global uncertainties? How to keep the bigger picture in perspective and find a way to promote international cooperation? I'm pleased to be joined in alphabetical orders from Gold Coast, Australia, by Professor Brendan McKee, Director of Climate Action Beacon of Griffith University. Professor Qi Ye joining us from Xiamen, southern China. He is from the Society Hub of Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. He's also professor of School of Public Policy and Management of Tsinghua University. And we are pleased to be joined by Mr. Masamba Tioye, Project Executive of UNFCCC Global Innovation Hub of the UN Climate Change Secretariat, joining us from Bonn, Germany. The warmest welcome to all three of you. And as I said earlier, we still have experts and scholars in the field of environment studies. We also have journalists and other guests in related field joining us from different parts of the world. The warmest welcome to you all as well. Let me go to Mr. Tioye first. The United Nations has been stressing the importance of international solidarity on resolving climate crisis, but at the same time, given the stability we just mentioned as a result of the conflict in Ukraine, for instance, many countries have adopted policies and actions that seem to pivot to prioritize energy security over energy transition. Is international cooperation on climate change being marginalized? And from the perspective of the innovation hub that you are leading under the convention, how does the picture look like?
Thank you for inviting me to join this very interesting panel. The current level of collaboration among nations to address the climate and sustainability challenge is definitely below what is required. Indeed, radical collaboration is needed, and we are not yet there. Now, more and more nations are seeking independence. And the question is whether we should aim at independence or interdependence and radical collaboration. Interdependence suggests that the entities recognize and value the importance of radical collaboration while maintaining a solid sense of self within the collaboration, without any need to compromise their identity or their value system. It involves a balance of self and others within the collaboration, arising from a deep understanding and an appreciation of the contribution of all entities involved. It promotes a mindset of problem solving and negotiation instead of competition.
Right. Well, thank you very much for expounding on the concept of collaboration versus independence or interdependency, because right now this is the core, I think, to a lot of the challenges we're faced with. And one case in point is the troubled relationship between China and the United States, two of the leaders, let's say, in global climate action. And the natural question a lot of people have at this moment is the kind of friction, increased friction between the two sides as a result of the US House Speaker's visit to Taiwan, because China announced it's going to suspend dialogue with the United States in terms of climate change. Professor McKee, let me get your insights. How do you look at the impact of this on global climate change collaboration and cooperation? Of course, we're not going to say who is to blame, who is what, but the sheer impact that this is going to have on the efforts that has been unfolding.
Yes, this is very serious. You know, we really are at a critical juncture. I actually say a critical juncture in the history of the human endeavour on this planet. I mean, we are in the midst of a climate emergency. You know, we're used to thinking about, I mean, what we're seeing play out with our geopolitics. And as you say, we're not here to talk about who's right or wrong, but just looking at the real politic of what's unfolding. It's actually a very long-standing tension in international negotiations, the wonderful negotiations that the UN has been moderating, the tension between short-term national self-interest and the long-term common good. Now, when it comes to the climate change problem, with international negotiations, we're used to thinking of them in what we call as a zero-sum game. There can be some barter, there can be some winners and some losers. If I win a bit, you have to lose a bit, or you can win a bit and I can lose a bit. It's called a zero-sum game. But climate change is a non-zero-sum game. We either all win or we all lose. Okay. And this is what the science is telling us very clearly, that there is no escape from climate change impacts. Wealthy countries are as exposed to climate change impacts and risks as are poor countries. They actually have more built assets that can be damaged by extreme weather events. They also have more adaptive capacity. And so this is why the UN in the Paris Agreement, there's what's called the global goal on adaptation, which is about this shared responsibility to look after each other, because there's nowhere that is safe from climate change impacts. So we've got this tension between what the science is telling us we're experiencing and looking at, and if you like, conventional ways of thinking about our international relationships. The climate change problem is one where we really have to do this radical collaboration, put aside our short-term national self-interests and work together. And it's very unfortunate that current geopolitics is putting up barriers to that.
Professor Chi, I would like to get some Chinese perspective from you naturally. I mean, of course, China is committed to fighting climate change, and yet it seems to a lot of people that this decision to suspend dialogue with the United States on climate change is an unfortunate one, which looks to impede the much-needed cooperation between the two sides on this critical issue. What is China's consideration, and why does China decide to take this step despite the much-needed cooperation that is already very much in deficit?
I think you're absolutely right. This is a very unfortunate situation that the United States and China are now suspending the climate talks. We have to realize that China-US cooperation on climate change has been crucial in global governance, global governance and actions on climate change. Recall back in November 2014 when U.S. and China signed the joint announcement on clean energy and climate cooperations. Next year, September 2015, President Xi and President Obama signed a joint declaration on climate change cooperation. And these documents actually set foundation for the Paris Agreement, which was signed, or which was reached in December 2015. And even last year, and last November at Glasgow, at the very last minute, COP26, and US and China worked together to release that joint declaration on climate actions. So we had very good and productive cooperation back then. Actually, climate change was just one of the very few issues that the two countries can actually talk to each other. But to work together, it takes two parties to work together, and but these cooperation really requires a broader foundation for the cooperation on climate change. And One China policy is actually the very critical part for this foundation. It's a cornerstone, in fact. When this foundation, when this One China policy is hollowed out, by irresponsible actions, then the foundation is shaken, and the cooperation is more like a shoot without a root, right? Then sooner or later, this shoot and the leaves on it will be withering. This is a very critical moment for the two countries to work together, but we do not really see the kind of a geopolitical environment for this climate cooperation. this is very, very unfortunate.
Mr. Thierry, let me bring you in there. What kind of impact is that having, or is that likely to have, on the much-needed radical international cooperation to fight climate change? And how do you look at the kind of realities right now as China and the United States are losing the political foundation where their trust can be built on? What can be done? What is the United Nations ready to do to salvage whatever is left there in terms of international cooperation on climate change?
Now, the UN can only provide space for countries to engage and cooperate and work together. What is absolutely needed is, let's say, the willingness of countries to use that space and work together to move forward on this very important topic, because there is no other alternative. We cannot address the challenge if we are not collaborating, and there is no alternative to addressing this challenge.
So it's a pretty bad situation we're looking at, Mr. Thierry.
But let's be optimistic. My understanding is that everybody is mindful of the situation in which we are, and the leadership will take the required action to do what is expected from them, because there is no other solution. We do not have an alternative. We have to address climate. So I have a strong expectation, and I hope that the leadership are also mindful of that, and they will find a way to talk to each other and to collaborate.
Professor McKee, let me bring you back into this dialogue. There is a so-called International Climate Club that's been announced by the G7 countries. They wanted to be open and cooperative, and they want to launch this club by the end of 2022. It's, I guess, another kind of cooperation that is being envisaged. Now, analysts say a new climate world order, if designed correctly, can be beneficial to amend a fragile global cooperation on climate change. How do you understand this proposal, and how effective do you think this mechanism can be in providing some kind of leadership and boosting the efforts in climate change?
Yeah, I think it's a really important initiative, and this concept of climate clubs, of different partnerships between various clusters of countries with common or shared interests and goals, I think it's really important. And it's a really important complementary mechanism to support implementation of the Paris Agreement and the negotiations going forward. Because this is one of the big challenges, you know, of course, what China and the USA do or don't do with their emissions is critically important, and what the EU does or doesn't do. But we have these other emerging economies, Nigeria, Turkey, Indonesia. You know, it's really critical that they get onto clean energy transitions rapidly. There's half a dozen countries which have massive economies, rapid growth, and it's equally important that they are also on this journey with us. It's not just, it doesn't all just fall on China and USA's shoulders.
Professor Chi, I wonder what is your take on this idea, because a club, you know, I think we Chinese are a little bit allergic to this term, because whenever there's a club that's being talked about, it's like, is it going to be exclusive or is it going to be open? Who are setting the rules? And especially when G7 is having a rather problematic relationship, or it starts to look problematic. How comfortable will this G7 climate club think about taking countries such as China into the club, or how comfortable will China be in joining one such group?
Well, I think in facing the challenge of global scale, like climate change, we really need to create and invent lots of different mechanisms on climate governance. And there is no question about that. The Climate Club is probably one of these you mentioned. But you're right. The G7 and is considered to be a club of the rich. And when it forms a climate club like this, then that makes you to think, well, if this is going to be a club that when the rich countries can, making the rules and setting the rules for climate change. And we need to think there is a governance mechanism, which is the United Nations Convention on Climate Change. And there have been lots of talks already, based on that mechanisms. I think we need to encourage any organization, with good intention and goodwill at the same time, and we need to be alert that any divisive efforts to tackle the climate change problem need to be we need to pay attention to that. Working together among all the countries should be encouraged and should be the right way to go.
Thank you. Okay, we have just enough time to have a quick Q&A session. Once again, the gentleman first, please.
Hi, my name is Shamim Zakaria. I'm a journalist with Xinhua News Agency in Beijing. My question is about collaboration, because one of the panelists started the session by talking about the significance of collaboration. So my question is, when the world is going through profound geopolitical changes, is it at all possible to look, to overlook the geopolitical changes or the conflict and then collaborate on, climate, on a big issue like climate change? And I'm asking for a particularly Chinese perspective, because we have time and again seen President Xi Jinping reiterate community for a shared future of humanity. So when you talk about the shared future of humanity, is it at all possible to overlook the geopolitical challenges and then focus on the bigger goal, like climate change? So I would like to point the question to Professor Chi and want to get a Chinese perspective on that.
Okay, Professor Chi.
Well, the first question, is it possible to collaborate under a very serious situation, geopolitics? Yeah, I think it is possible, but it is likely, but probably not very likely at the moment. Right now, as I said, we're not only facing the climate change problem, but we're facing lots of other problems: economic, financial, geopolitical, and public health. And you're absolutely right. And we really need to work together toward that shared community, for the future. But right now we're not actually moving to that. What can we do? Well, what is really lacking is a better communications. We're not really having that communications among the countries, among the groups, among the different peoples. I think that's really something we need. That is why I think this kind of a conversation that Liu Xin is organizing right now, very, very important.
Thank you so much, Professor Chi Ye, for the answers. And with that, we are coming to the end of this Global Thinkers panel discussion on climate change challenges and how to boost or restore international solidarity and cooperation. Many thanks to the other panelists. And with that, we come to the end of this Global Thinkers Forum. Many thanks for your participation. And as always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Lucian in Beijing. Have your say. Send me something if you want. And on behalf of the whole team, thank you very much for joining us. And you've got the point.